This video covers Part 1 of Chapter 3, Sensation and Perception for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this chapter, you're going to be learning about how we take in information about the physical world and how we make sense of it through our sensory systems. We're going to focus our attention on the two sensory systems that have gotten the most research attention. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is as we go along. So we're going to focus our attention on vision and hearing. Given that we have a great deal of research on how the visual system works, the chapter will actually spend the greatest deal of time looking at the visual systems. Before we get started, and the example here is using vision, we need to define some concepts. When we are talking about sensation and perception, we have to think about them in combination. Without sensation, you can't do perception. Without perception, you wouldn't be able to make sense of the stimuli that are outside of you. So our understanding of the world is dependent on both of these processes. Sensation refers to pulling in sensory information from the outside world. So you have sensory organs and a variety of sensory systems that enable us to pick up information in the form of light, sound. We use our sensation to make sense of touch stimuli, as well as smell and taste. All of these sensory systems mean that we have to take literal information in raw form and then make it make sense. So you have the stimulation from the external environment, and that has to be transduced. Once that is transduced, what you have is sensation. But then the brain has to make sense of what is out there. That's perception. Perception involves interpreting the information that allows us to experience the world. Sensation and perception give us the raw data. Sensation gives us the raw data. Perception is the cognitive processing that helps us to define what it is that we are experiencing. There's always the question when you talk about sensation and perception of is what you're perceiving the same as objective reality? In some senses, this is a philosophical question, but it's also a practical one. Our perceptual systems are limited. They're limited in the sense of what we can in fact sense, but they're also limited by our experiences. So what we perceive doesn't necessarily exactly replicate the world that's around us. Our perception of the world is subjective, and our experiences in the past, as well as our cultural definitions, have a strong influence on the way in which we form perceptions of our environment. This means that there are times when our view of the world is simply wrong. This becomes really obvious when you look at illusions, visual illusions. There are also auditory illusions as well, and likely other forms of illusions too. The example that you're given in the text is this idea of turning the tables, and it is an example, as the title underneath the image shows, of a misperception. So when you're looking at these two tables, they appear to have completely different shapes, completely different dimensions. However, when they are rotated independently, they are the same. When you look at this image, though, it just defies logic for you to say to yourself, these are the same table. But it's one of those bizarre things that your brain can't see them as identical. until they are physically moved. Now, we do have the capacity to do kind of mental rotation, but illusions like this one make it very difficult for us to render that judgment that they are in fact the same. Examples like this led to a lot of the early research into psychophysics to try and make sense of these idiosyncratic differences in the way people were perceiving the world. Wilhelm Wundt, who's pictured here, I love old photos, was the founder of the first formal laboratory in psychology. It was founded in Leipzig, Germany. Psychophysical research, if you break that word apart, psycho is the psychological component, physical refers to the physical world. So what you're looking at is the connection between that physical world and our psychological perception of it. The questions that Wundt and his students and colleagues were looking at originally eventually defined these two kind of foundational questions of how do we detect stimuli in the environment, and then how do we tell whether or not a stimulus in the environment has changed in a meaningful enough way that we can perceive it. And what they were really wanting to document in those early studies was the limits of the human perceptual system. The detection question, as it is described in your text, is concerned with the limitations to our ability to see things or hear things that are very faint. So what is the dimmest light that you can perceive at a reliable distance? So let's say if you put a light 25 feet away, just to pick a random number out of the air, what is the dimmest light that you would still be able to see and detect? So that's the detection question. The difference question, on the other hand, is if I put that dim light 25 feet away in a darkened room, how much would I have to change it in order for you to perceive that there was in fact a change? The scaling question is the third question that we're going to be looking at as we move our way through this first part of the chapter. The scaling question is concerned with how we perceive and understand intensities of stimuli that we can actually detect. So that question, and I'll elaborate on that a little more later. We're really wanting to understand how we make sense of magnitudes of difference, how intense a stimulus is. We're going to start with the detection question. So if we're thinking about light or sound, which are, for humans, those are our dominant senses in terms of our everyday experience. So what's the dimmest light or the softest sound that we can hear? The early psychophysicists wanted to look at various amounts of energy in sensory stimuli, so the intensity of light or sound, and asked people to answer yes/no questions about whether or not they could perceive the light or perceive the sound. Now, if you went into an audiologist for a hearing test, you would have to complete similar tests to what these early psychophysicists were doing to determine the limits of your ability to detect faint sounds. The absolute threshold refers to the minimum amount of energy that is needed that you can detect half the time. So, you want to get to at least 50%, and that's referred to as an absolute threshold in terms of your ability to detect a stimulus. This image is a depiction of the results that psychophysical researchers thought they would observe in their early studies. So theoretically, they thought, so the top image, image A, theoretically the absolute threshold is the minimum amount of physical energy in a stimulus necessary to detect it. if a stimulus doesn't have that amount of intensity, it should never be detected, was what they originally argued. The bottom image, though, is what the psychophysical researchers actually found in their research. There was no one amount of physical energy in a stimulus that led to the kind of responding that they expected to see in their work. Instead, what they found was this soft S-shaped curve, which it really showed that there was no specific kind of moment where you had crossed the absolute threshold. So the absolute threshold was defined more statistically as the minimum amount of energy detected 50% of the time instead of 100% of the time. And that was an early discovery. The concept of subliminal stimuli is kind of dependent on that absolute threshold. So the absolute threshold is detecting something a minimum of 50% of the time. What are stimuli that are below that threshold? Those are referred to as subliminal stimuli. So you're perceiving them, you're recognizing them less than half the time. In this graphic, what you're seeing is that's just a visual depiction of the threshold for perception, and everything below that is referred to as subconscious, meaning your brain could be receiving signals about a stimulus, but it isn't intense enough to be recognized at a conscious level so that you could make a decision and say, yes, it's there. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some degree of cortical recognition of that stimulation. It's just that perceptually we're not to the point where we can perceive it reliably. And that's really what's required for perceiving that the event has occurred. So subliminal doesn't mean that the stimulus wasn't detected, even consciously detected. At the same time, you may have heard of subliminal persuasion, and there are lots of urban legends about how it works, but there's no empirical evidence that subliminal persuasion actually works. So, if somebody's trying to sell you audio tapes or MP4 files or something like that to help you change your behavior or to teach you things when you're not conscious, we don't have any empirical evidence that that's a thing. So just sort of ignore those claims. There is, however, empirical evidence that sensory input can get in to usually, if you're talking about vision, to the occipital lobe in the visual cortex. So there could be cells that fire in response to sensory input, but if a person is asked, they are below that threshold of being able to consciously recognize what their brain may have perceived or may have sensed. So that can be detected in a lot of ways. There are tools that psychophysicists use in order to determine whether or not cells are firing. Subliminal perceptions are fast, they're dim, or they're not even close to loud, and they don't appear to have any sort of long-term impacts in terms of our behaviors, primarily because they're just not processed. So the stimulation may get in, but they're not processed to the point where they're meaningful. So they're not translated into anything we could actually act on. Your authors also note that there's no empirical evidence for extrasensory perception either, which would really depend on having the capacity to violate some of these psychophysical rules. One theory that is used to help us understand how we detect stimuli coming from the environment is signal detection theory. The basic assumption of the theory is that The ability to detect faint stimuli depends on your, first, your own personal sensitivity to stimuli, and then also on the criterion for detecting. And that is going to be based on a variety of factors that don't have anything to do with your sensory systems. Non-sensory factors include things like personality, expectations, how alert you are, how motivated you are. So, for instance, compare me with my oldest brother. My oldest brother is a very, very experienced, very talented hunter. If we were sitting in the same woods, based on his personality, his training, his level of practice, his expectations, his motivation to detect when prey are moving, he's going to be more sensitive to changes in his environment that indicate the possibility that a deer is present, for example, or a wild turkey is present, for example. So all kinds of things can be involved in our ability to detect signals. A signal that is constant and faint is going to be presented on a trial or no signal basis. So basically, if you're in one of these studies, a stimulus at a constant level of intensity is going to be presented in a go or no-go kind of situation, and then the person is going to be asked to say yes or no. Was the signal present? And obviously the person, the observer, doesn't know which trial is going to have the signal and which trial is not going to have the signal. There are two quantitative measures here. First, you have the physiological sensitivity to faint signals, and then you have the decision criterion. How much evidence is needed for you to say yes? Now, these studies have been done in, looking at the visual system, the auditory system, and other sensory systems as well. Now, as is described in your text, in any given trial, you have the possibility for 4 outcomes. If the signal is actually there and the observer says yes, that's a hit. If the signal is absent and the observer says yes, that's a false alarm. Now, think about, let's say you're an air traffic controller and you're watching your screen. It's very important that if you see a change in your screen, that you be correct in identifying that the presence of a stimulus. If you raise a false alarm, that's a little less dangerous than if you have a full miss. So the signal is present, but the observer says, no, it's not there. That can be disastrous if you're the air traffic controller. If the signal's absent and you say no, that's a correct rejection in that case. So you can find real world situations where this is pretty darned important for people to recognize and make the right decision about. Now we'll shift to the difference question, and the image here is of Ernst Weber, of Weber's law. The question here is, what's the smallest difference in brightness between lights or loudness between sounds that we can detect? So, for example, if you're in a dimly lit room, a little bit of light is going to be noticed pretty immediately. And it's not just that the physical environment is dark. It's also, changes in your eyes where you're allowing in the maximum amount of light in that darkened space. In a brightly lit room, the same goes. It's going to be much harder because of the brightness of the room and because of the way you're adapted to the light in the room. It's going to be a lot harder to notice a change in that light. In both cases, what's going on mathematically is the proportion of the background intensity that's needed to see an increase in brightness or to hear an increase in loudness, the proportion is going to be about the same. We notice the proportional differences, not the absolute differences. So the difference threshold is referred to as the minimum change between two stimuli that we can detect half the time. So we've got the same kind of thing with, detection. What's the dimmest light you can detect 50% of the time? What's the softest sound you can detect 50% of the time? Here, what difference is required for you to detect that change at least half the time? Another term that's been used to describe this difference threshold is a just noticeable difference. In the research, what is done is that the researcher will present two stimuli on each trial and vary the amount of difference between them across different presentations. The stimulus whose intensity remains the same is the standard. Then you make variations across trials and you compare the stimulus. Weber's law, created by the gentleman in the photo, says that for each type of sensory judgment that we are asked to make, the difference threshold is a constant fraction of the standard stimulus value used to measure it. So I'm not going to get into the weeds of exactly the math of that because it's not that important. It's mostly that, what we're doing is looking at proportional differences, and as opposed to an absolute difference. You have to take into consideration the environment that surrounds the stimuli that you're making the judgment about. So in everyday life, what this means is that Weber's law tells us that our ability to see differences is going to be connected to the background intensity of light or sound, for example. So here's a little video clip. It's not the perfect example. This is a YouTuber named Brad Ray, who gives us just a concrete way of thinking about Weber's law.
Well, here I am in my car, and I'm going to use my car stereo here to do a demonstration of absolute threshold, difference threshold, and Weber's law. All right, there's a song playing, and I'm going to turn it up very slowly. Right now it's on 0, volume of 0. I'm going to turn it up very slowly, and the second you hear it, it will have crossed your absolute threshold. Now the volume's on 1. You hear it? 2. If you hear it now, it just crossed your absolute threshold. It's on 3. Now you probably hear it. It's at 4. It probably crossed your absolute threshold. 5, 6, 7. I hope you can hear it by now. It's probably crossed your absolute threshold. So the second that you can hear something, or see something, or feel something, the second that you detect it, the second it goes from nothing to something, it crosses your absolute threshold. Difference threshold is when you can detect a difference in a stimulus. So if I crank this up to like 20, it's pretty loud. If I change it 1, it's hard to tell a difference. Can you tell the difference between 20 and 10? I'm sure you can. You can probably tell the difference between 20 and 10. If you can tell a difference when I turn down the volume, it's crossed your difference threshold. Now, it's easier to tell a difference between something like 5 and 10, right? 5 to 10. You can tell the difference. But I'm going to turn it all the way up to 25 and see if you can tell the difference between 25 and 20. Or how about 30 and 25? harder to tell the difference when a stimulus is really loud, or really bright in terms of light, or really smelly in terms of smell. Well, here in terms of sound, it's harder to tell the difference between 20 or 30 and 35 than it is to tell the difference between like 10 and 15. Easy, right? Now 30 to 35. So that's Weber's law. Weber's law shows that it's easier to tell the difference between a low stimulus, and it's harder to detect a change in a really loud stimulus. There you go.
So that gives you a concrete example that you can remember pretty easily for both the absolute threshold as well as the difference threshold. Now we'll move on to the scaling question, and this image is of S.S. Stevens, who was one of the people who did research in this area. The scaling question is concerned with how we perceive the magnitudes or the intensities of clearly detectable stimuli. So we're not talking about super faint sounds or super bright or super dim lights. We're talking about things that are pretty easy to detect. The question then becomes, how do the scales of measurement that we're using to understand perceptual stimuli relate to the physical scales of measurement? So what you're really wanting to look at is you have physical stimuli like frequencies of sound waves or light. We have physical scales to measure those things like decibels for sound, in light intensity for like how many watts is in your light bulb. We have physical measures of those things. How does that relate to the scale that our perceptual systems operate on? For almost all types of sensory judgments, these scales are different. The literal sensory signals, like frequencies of sounds, frequencies of light, and so on, don't match up perfectly with the perceptual system, because it has to go through that transduction and then be perceived and given meaning. So the scales in terms of judgments that we make are different. How different? Well, Stevens' power law is what helps us to make sense of that. The description of the Stevens power law that you're provided with in your text reads as follows. The perceived magnitude of a stimulus, for example, perceived brightness or perceived loudness, is equal to its actual physical intensity raised by some constant number. Now, as in all of these theories in this chapter, I'm not going to get into the weeds of the math of this. It's not necessary for your understanding. The critical component, though, is that we are not, the way our perceptual systems work, we are not directly translating the literal sensory signals that are coming in a one-to-one way. Our perceptual systems are limited and they're targeted. So, for example, in our hearing, we have the best hearing in the area that is directly related to human speech. So that's, your perceptual system is built to tune in essentially to specific things. So you need Stevens' power law to bridge that gap between the raw stimulus and what is actually perceived the most effectively. Sensory adaptation refers to another just sort of fact of our sensory perception, our sensation perception life. If you are exposed to a stimulus for long enough, For instance, in this room that I'm recording in, my furnace is just on the other side of the wall. And when I first sat down to get ready to record, it seemed really, really loud. And now that I'm talking about it, it seems really loud again. But before I mentioned it, I wasn't paying any attention to it at all. That's a concrete example of sensory adaptation. If you have an unchanging repetitious stimulus, your awareness of it is going to diminish rapidly because it doesn't require our attention. It's not changing. It's not providing any new information, so we adapt to it and basically just don't recognize it as important. Our senses are designed to detect changes of particular kinds in our environment, and that means that you're designed to ignore the continuous, to ignore things that are not meaningfully important for you to perceive. So what that suggests is we need to be able to filter out noise. We need to be able to filter out excess visual stimuli that aren't going to be helpful for us in terms of our survival in our environment. Now, there are some things we don't adapt to. If a stimulus is particularly intense or painful, then we don't adapt to that. That will remain because it's important information. And people are differently sensitive. Some people are easily adapt to what another person would find to be an intensely painful sound or visual stimulus. So there are tremendous individual differences in the degree to which we can adapt our sensory systems. We also usually don't adapt to things that are unchanging in our visual field, primarily because we tend, whether we want to or not, to experience the world through constantly moving eyes. Now, part of that is just the design of our visual system and the physical attributes of the musculature and the makeup of the eyes that keeps us sort of constantly readjusting. If your eyes couldn't do that, you would, if your eyes are held absolutely 100% still, you would stop the sensory neurons that make up that system would stop responding. So we can't do that. You can't just, if you're focusing on a screen, like if you stare at the S in sensory adaptation, it would, if you were actually able to fixate on it completely, the S would eventually disappear. But it doesn't do that. That's because your eyes make thousands and thousands of tiny little movements all the time in order to keep that sensory information running. Now, another concept is called habituation, which is a decreased behavioral response that it comes from repeated exposure. Your authors talk about this with respect to odors. If you are repeatedly exposed to a smell, it doesn't matter if it's a pleasant smell or an unpleasant one, being repeatedly exposed to it will allow it to diminish. So that's habituation. Adaptation relates specifically to neural processes that contribute to habituation, to the habituation effect. Habituation shows up in forms of behavioral responses, whereas adaptation is strictly the neural process that contributes to it. And that concludes my coverage of part 1.